on the policy stage to advance the really ambitious goals that the Nature Conservancy has. And I think I have a slide that outlines those goals. And prior to that, I just wanted to kind of put a reminder out there to everyone, and I need to have this reminder. And Casey was reminded me too that we went from the 70s into the 80s in terms of countries and territories where we have a presence and an impact. And we need people like John, going to the the COP meetings, and but we also need people like Michelle working at the local level, spinning out innovation and local solutions that can then be scaled up. And so, what I really love about TNC, and this was just sort of a reminder, is that we do operate at a very large scale, but we also are very unique in that we're an organization that has deep local contacts. We've been around in the Maryland, DC chapter since the 1970s. And through that long history, we've developed deep partnerships where we can think about how policy can really expand our conservation work. And so with that, I think I wanted to just let folks know that we have some ambitious goals for various conservation actions. And so if you go to the next slide. I wanted to just sort of let people know that we have these guiding stars for us to follow in terms of our interest and passion for addressing the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And we've even run the numbers for Maryland and DC in terms of these global ambitions, and we feel like we can potentially mitigate 73 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents right here in Maryland, contributing to that 3 gigaton ambitious goal. Similarly, we have some people that care about the Chesapeake. We have about 1 million hectares of estuarine habitat that we feel like we can continue to make strides in improving and restoring the bay, which will contribute to these global goals. So local is important, but keeping our eye on these big global targets is essential for the Nature Conservancy to have success. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers, John and Michelle. So John Verdick is the Director of the International Climate Policy at TNC. And in this role, he works to improve policy between international climate change agreements and national level actions. And John is an alumni of the US State Department, where he negotiated climate policy and now leads our delegations to the big global gatherings, including the COP meetings. And Michelle is our local government relations director for TNC, and she came from the national policy program here at the Conservancy, and she leads federal, state, and local policy strategies and collaborate with our conservation team right here in Maryland, DC, to make sure that they have impact. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to John first to lead us off. And I'm going to urge you to do what Casey asked you to do, which is to put questions in the chat as they come. And then John is going to hand it over to Michelle. So John, take it away, please. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks all. So excited to be here, and thanks for having me. You can just go into the next slide here. I'll kind of frame up the overall picture. This graph is kind of busy, I know, especially to start out as a first slide for you to all look at. So don't worry about looking at any of the words or any of the stuff, and I'll walk you through it really quickly. But the title of this slide is From Ambition to Implementation. This is the biggest thing that we want to do in TNC globally right now in the climate realm. We know a lot of countries have come out since the Paris Agreement in 2015 and put new pledges forward that they're going to reduce their emissions and become more resilient, but they haven't always known how. And so a little bit of what I'm going to walk you through is how we're trying to drive this. Yes, we finally got this big global Paris Agreement, which is fantastic, to how do we use it to drive and ratchet emissions down year after year. So the vertical axis on the left, you can see starts in 2015, and this is most of these from the UN start then because the Paris Agreement was signed then. And so we want to look at kind of from top to bottom. I'll walk you through this a little bit, which is why we're doing what we're doing to reduce emissions. And at first, when Paris was signed, if you look at the gray line on top, it really looks at where we were with old policies. And we're aiming towards about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius back then. Not good at all. Then the next blue line down looked at the current policies. This was the first round of NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions, which is just the kind of code in the UN for a country's pledge to the Paris Agreement. So when we came in with the first round of NDCs, all of a sudden we saw emissions ratchet down. Then 5 years later, there was a second round of NDCs. Just a year ago, well, it really was supposed to be in 2020, but because of COVID, a lot of countries turned in their second pledge in 2021, but we saw the emissions ratchet down again. Now, the good news about this is we're seeing this bar graph, we're seeing these emissions we're starting to bend the curve. The bad news is we're still at 2.6, 2.4, depending on what estimates we want to use. We're not looking at 2 degrees yet, and we're definitely not looking at 1.5, which is where we really probably need to get. So what do we do with this? We'll go to the next slide and we'll start to look at a couple of our steps that we take and how we look at it. This is almost that same chart, but broken down in a different way to look at it. This is country by country. And a little bit what you're going to hear in a minute, and Tim alluded to it, and you heard it from Michelle, is what we're doing in one country also matters for another country. We are a large organization in 80 countries and territories. If we learn something good in the United States that works, we share it with our Brazil team, we share it with our China team, we share it with our Fiji team, and then we share it back and forth. The other thing that we do is we kind of take some of the work that we do at the global level and trying to write rule sets and advocate for good emissions kind of in the United Nations level. And we take that back and share it with our country teams to make sure that we're designing programs that fit and work into those programs. At that same time, we're taking the solutions that we learn in Maryland, that we learn in Acre in Brazil, and we're taking them back to the United Nations, into the UNFCCC negotiators and saying, hey, this actually works. Your country's actually already doing this. Don't be afraid about agreeing to something more ambitious. We can help you, and this is kind of what it looks like. With that, I would say one of the ways that we're working on this is, so, the United Nations it's tricky because it takes a long time and it takes forever to get some of these agreements, to get 196 countries to agree on what the language is going to be. But when you get it, it becomes a very powerful tool. Now, the next way that we start to work on this is we've been working with many countries around the world on how to update their NDC. Like I mentioned, there's kind of 5-year cycles for NDCs. So the second a country turns its own NDC in, like the United States, when President Biden came in with the new 50 to 52% reductions by 2030, a day later, we're already thinking, what's the next one going to be? How do we start getting the data for them to make decisions so that they can come out with the next plan? We're doing it in Colombia, we're doing it in China, we're doing it in Indonesia. We're sharing these lessons and we're trying to build it all in. And one of the really interesting things that I hadn't always realized is we always push for nature to be part of the story and for nature to be part of the solution. And when you go and you talk to the countries and what they want to put into these pledges, they all say, yes, of course we want nature, but we don't know how, or we don't have the finance to do it. Help us. And so this will go into the next slide of, here's a bit of the finance picture. Again, I'm sorry about a second kind of messy slide. Don't pay attention to any of the numbers except for the black bold ones on the top going along the horizontal side, where it goes from 52 over to 79. There was a pledge in 2009 in the Copenhagen COP of the UNFCCC that said there will be a mobilization of $100 billion per year by 2020. If you look at this graph, and then as it keeps projecting out, obviously we didn't make it by 2020. And these funds are supposed to be public funds and private funds, which is why the word mobilize was used. So right about now in 2023, this goal is finally being met. Developing countries are a little upset because it wasn't met. On the other hand, you look at the amount of finance available from before that 2009 pledge and what's there now, it has increased quite a bit. But we need to increase it dramatically more. How do we do this? Well, I'd say take a look at the the 3 colors here. You have a pink, you have a light blue, and a dark blue. The dark blue is bilateral grants. It would be like USAID doing a program in Zambia. The middle is the multilateral development banks or multilateral public funding. This is money that United States or Norway or somebody gives to the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank and executes. Still public funding. And then the little fifth, the pink up top, is private finance. One of the things we're really trying to do is we're trying to flip this. We're thinking, obviously public budgets are usually constrained. Many countries can't just go in every year and say, we want to triple our public finance for this. It doesn't always get through legislators. So if we are just going to assume that these two, the dark blue and the light blue portions, stay the same, our way to increase this is to bring in more private finance. And we'd love to see that pink bar just go, off the charts is kind of our goal. So how do we do that? Next slide, if you could. We do it many different ways in many different countries. Different things work in different places. I picked out this picture here because we had this wonderful debt swap that happened in Barbados recently, where we were able to use not TNC funds, but actually external funds to do most of this work. We did a lot of the work on the inside, and and stitching things together. But, you know, we've worked with the US Treasury. We've worked with private banks that can take a lot of the, put a lot of this on their liability charts or on their books. We've worked with private insurance companies that can do the de-risking and actually take the political risk insurance. And we build this kind of comprehensive package of public and private funds with us kind of at the middle, swirling it all around and bundling it up. And we get deals that can reduce debt in countries. At the same time, we get a better conservation outcome. Now, I'd say conservation, or if we say climate, we're doing many of these programs have an overlap. You know, when you have coastal areas, whether it's going to be the coral or whether it's going to be the mangroves and the carbon sequestered, we try to look at both of these cohesively. Another thing that we're doing is we're pushing carbon markets. We're trying to drive finance to the ground to reduce emissions. With this, we're looking at it in two different ways. One is we're pushing quite hard to raise the bar of what standards are for carbon markets. We're trying to make sure, you know, they're never going to be bulletproof. You're looking at a forward projected outcome, trying to get what it is, making a baseline with the available data. And we're trying to reduce, we're trying to, you know, keep stitching that together. Year after year, we learn from past projects and we're getting better and better. The other thing we're trying to do is not just do them better, but we're trying to do them bigger. How do we take an old project that we used to have in a, you know, geographically constrained area and, you know, make it 10 times that, or make it the size of Wyoming? Costa Rica has a national plan now. How do we start to build these out bigger and bigger to whether they're states or jurisdictions or provinces or countries? Because the scale of what we need to do and the action we need to do to solve the climate crisis is just growing year after year. We're also working very hard to build our solutions into other institutions, such as the World Bank, such as the IMF. We're taking the debt conversion piece that you're seeing here on the picture, and we're trying to now almost sell it into the World Bank and the IMF, meaning we've done a couple of these transactions. We're a world leader, but we're trying to work ourselves out of business at the moment. Because if we want this to really get at the scale that the Earth needs, we need those public finance dollars. We need the IMF. We need the World Bank really engaged in building these programs bigger. Also, we can do one or two. You know, it takes a year, it takes 2 years to do some of these. If they go in with these huge organizations, our hope is that they will get many, many more. And then the next slide, I was kind of getting close. This is my last slide. Our big thing here again, and the title is, how do we influence the system through available solutions? A couple of those solutions I just talked about, whether it's using nature to reduce emissions and then help out countries' Paris pledges, whether it's using private finance to scale up all of our work, all of this builds together to make all of these different countries have better pledges. When China sees the United States with a stronger pledge, it puts China on the agenda next. When the EU sees that the US now has legislation to back up its 50 to 52% target through the IRA, now all of a sudden the EU's back on the next level. And we need to just keep ratcheting all these countries up to increase their ambition and reduce emissions over and over. And where do we do that? You know, I work a lot at the global scale and trying to stitch all these things together and bring them together. Michelle is going to talk to you a little bit about where the action actually really happens. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you sharing TNC's global climate policy priorities and how we're leveraging financing and taking our solutions to scale so that we can have the most impact and motivate the most change on a global level worldwide, as well as here. I hope that all the attendees will take a moment to put their questions into the chat if they want to know anything more from John after we finish with our speakers today. And then we'll go to the next slide and welcome Michelle Dietz, who is the Director of Government Relations for the MDDC chapter, as Tim mentioned earlier. She is going to help us understand what's happening here in Maryland and what our policy priorities are going forward. Michelle, are you ready to lead on?
Yes, thank you so much, Casey. And hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to come and talk with you all. It's really exciting to share more about the work that we're doing here in Maryland in the conservation and climate policy space. So it's great to hear from John about what TNC is doing at the global scale, but really exciting to talk more about what we're also doing here at the state and local scale in the climate policy arena. Like Tim said, we are working to influence policy to reach our ambitious 2030 goals. There's a lot that we need to do to preserve nature, protect life, reduce the impacts of climate change. And enacting policy at all levels of government really stands out, continues to stand out as the way that we can scale up our conservation work and accomplish these goals. And in the US, TNC is working on policy in all 50 states, and our chapters are working together to advance science-based, solutions-oriented, and nonpartisan policy at the federal, the state, and the local level. Next slide, please. And in Maryland, we're in a really unique position to work on climate policy. We're a small state, but we're experiencing the impacts of climate change at some of the highest rates in the country. Sea level rise in the Chesapeake Bay has risen about a foot in the past century. This is twice the global average. We also have some really exciting decision makers in power right now who are dedicated to climate action, and they're committed to setting us on a pathway towards ambitious carbon mitigation goals to help us achieve high levels of impact. And this means that Maryland has the opportunity to take a strong stance on climate, to pass comprehensive policies that can set us up to reduce carbon emissions, and to invest in nature to enhance our state's resilience to the changes that we're already seeing today. So I'm excited to share a little bit more with you about climate policy wins at the state level that TNC has helped to advocate for in Maryland and what this means for us moving forward. So next slide, please. So in order to curb the impacts of climate change, we first need to understand how the various industries and land uses contribute to carbon emissions in our state. And so I'm sharing this graph just to highlight some of the largest emitting sectors and sources of carbon in Maryland over the past few years. At the top emitter, you can see here in green, is the transportation sector. So this is emissions from vehicles like personal cars and trucks, buses, heavy duty vehicles. But that's actually in blue, apologies, not green. And then this is followed by electricity use in green, and then fuel usage in red. And I'm just showing this to give a better understanding where carbon is coming from in our economy, because once we know this, we can work to find common sense policy solutions that target reductions in these key sectors in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. So leaders in Maryland use the information to inform the passage of a comprehensive suite of climate mitigation policies last year, also known as the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. The Maryland General Assembly passed this bill with a supermajority, and it sets ambitious emissions reductions goals for our state. There's a 60% reduction goal by 2031 and a net zero emissions reduction by 2045. The bill targets the vehicle emissions, building energy use, and energy generation, so those top three sectors that we saw on that graph in the previous slide. It also tasks our state agencies with identifying some next steps for Maryland to take action to reduce the impacts of climate change, and then set some specific targets for the state government, like reducing emissions in state-owned vehicles by state-owned buildings by 2035 and public buildings by 2040. And then in the vehicle side of things, state vehicle fleets will be transitioned to zero emissions vehicles in passenger cars by 2031 and light-duty vehicles by 2036. It also establishes a task force to study building electrification and infrastructure needs. So this is a standard-setting bill. And the Climate Solutions Now Act puts Maryland on a path to lead the nation in addressing climate change in a responsible, achievable, and equitable manner. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I did want to talk a little bit about TNC's role in some policy development around the Climate Solutions Now Act. Over the past few years, we've been working collaboratively with the state government and partners to think through policy solutions that will reduce emissions in the building sector and the transportation sector. And on the building side of things, the Nature Conservancy helped to fund some policy research and analysis that was used to inform components of the Climate Solutions Now Act. My colleague, Kate Kerr, who's our climate and conservation policy analyst, sat on a working group, a statewide working group, to look at how policies could incentivize building decarbonization and electrification. And some of the more ambitious pieces didn't make the final bill cut, but the call for zero emissions in state-owned buildings by 2035 and the task force are also results of the working group's effort. And the graph that we have on this slide here shows some projected trend lines for emissions in the building sector under successful implementation of policy recommendations from the working group. And we're hopeful that additional policy solutions over the next few years can help us to meet these goals. And then also Tim Purinton, our executive director, is an integral member of our team here on the climate mitigation work. He sits on the Maryland Mitigation Working Group, which reports to our state's Commission on Climate Change. And annually, they bring forward proposals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state while supporting economic development and job creation. And right now, TNC and the Mitigation Working Group are thinking through how to accelerate vehicle electrification in Maryland how to use policy levers and incentives to make this happen. And the study that we're working on right now should be wrapping up in the next month or so and will help to inform some policy decisions in the coming years. So by working with partners to build consensus, by funding data-driven environmental and economic research, and taking time to develop these comprehensive policy solutions and recommendations, TNC is setting ourselves up to advocate for additional climate policy in Maryland in the coming years, building off the success of the Climate Solutions Now Act. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I did just want to touch on nature-based solutions as well. We're a leader in climate mitigation policy in Maryland, but climate change is here, and we know that nature can help us adapt to the changes that we're already seeing and what's to come. And in order to achieve effective climate solutions, we need adaptation policy to work hand in hand with mitigation policy. So in Maryland, we've also been focusing on solutions, policy solutions that enhance and preserve nature-based solutions and that can provide carbon storage and support climate resilience. And so I just wanted to mention two of those policies here too that tie together nature-based solutions and some innovative financing that the Nature Conservancy has worked to advocate for and advance over the past 2 years. The first is the Conservation Finance Act of 2022. Last year, the Maryland General Assembly passed this bill that advances nature-based solutions in Maryland to clean our waterways, sequester carbon, and to mitigate climate change. This bill builds more equity into our environmental investments by increasing access to state revolving loan funds for communities that are most impacted by climate and environmental health risks. It also codifies nature as infrastructure and actually defines natural infrastructure in our building codes. And it expands state agencies' abilities to use pay-for-success contracting for environmental restoration and projects, making investments more efficient and effective. And so TNC has had some experience working with Maryland state agencies on that public-private partnership opportunity, and we were able to work with coalition partners to think through bill language and to provide input and insights in the bill drafting process. We were also able to add in an amendment that made the final bill that was drafted by our Resilient Coast Director, Jackie Specht, that creates a blue carbon pilot program in Maryland's Department of Natural Resources. And this will study carbon storage projects in marine and estuary habitats and learn about how we could establish and verify carbon credits from these systems. So the Conservation Finance Act is really exciting. It's an important marker bill in Maryland, and its goals is to help to realize the potential of markets to finance environmental improvements at lower costs. And we're really excited to continue to engage as this bill is being implemented and to see how these innovative solutions can bring about some environmental possibilities in Maryland. And depending on the successes of different places of this bill as well, how we could potentially replicate successes in other states across the US. And then one final bill I want to just mention, the Conservation Finance Act is the second out of 2 bills that we've worked on over the past few years that looks at increasing access to state revolving loan funds for conservation work. In 2021, the Nature Conservancy worked with our partners at the American Forest Foundation to advocate for a bill that would expand access to water quality state revolving loan funds. And prior to this bill, mostly those funds were used to guarantee loans for wastewater treatment plants. But now the revolving loan fund can provide financial assistance for a wide range of projects that improve water quality across the state, including ones that are nature-based and have nature-based solutions like implementing forest protection and management plans. And exciting and timely news, last month, the Maryland Department of Environment announced a first of its kind $2.5 million loan guarantee through the Maryland Water Quality State Revolving Loan Fund that will go towards financing natural climate solutions in Maryland's family-owned forests. And because of the passage of the bill in 2021, private finances can now be used to generate carbon credits through the Family Forest Carbon Program. And the guarantee of this is the first of its kind, and it leverages carbon markets and private finances to fund natural climate solutions and to improve water quality. And it really sets a national precedent for using state revolving loan funds to fight the effects of climate change through forest conservation. So a really great example, both these bills are great examples of innovative climate solutions in Maryland and ones that we're really hoping that we can see replicated in other states across the country. And kind of reiterating John's point, at the Nature Conservancy, when we see something that's good and something that's working, we try to replicate that across our entire organization. So I will pause there just to say, Maryland's in a really unique position right now. We're leading in the mitigation space. We've seen innovative financing opportunities around nature-based solutions, and there's a lot of really exciting potential right now in the policy arena. So excited to answer any questions that you guys have, talk a little bit more about what's going on in Maryland. And thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate you closing out the dialogue and being our second speaker. So I hope people will take this opportunity to just grab a few minutes and put their questions into the chat. I know there's a lot of technical terminology floating around out there, and we do have a couple of clarifying questions that I'd like to put out to the speakers first. John, on one of your slides, there was a mention of something called a stock take. And when we're talking about conservation, often stock is thought of as fisheries or land resources. But because you specialize in finance, do you mean the stock exchange, or do you mean the taking of resources? Can you tell us a little more about that, please?
Actually, different than both of those. It's the idea of taking stock of where we're at. There's this, so the global stock take was the language used in the Paris Agreement that in 2015, when we wrote it, it said in 2023, 8 years from now, we're going to come back, we're going to take stock of where we're at and the things that are working to look at how we go forward from here.
Well, that turns out to have been an excellent question, since it was misunderstood widely.
Sorry
That's
about that little
wonderful.
nuance of those words of, I think I use
No,
it every day.
That's why we do the digital dialogue, so that we can all understand what we're talking about a little bit better. Another question that came in, and this is sort of generic, it could be for Michelle or John, is actually to talk about putting, someone asked for perspective on our climate goal, like understanding a gigaton, understanding what does that mean? Is there any way to think of it in a more solid sense than a bigger number than you can imagine today?
It's a huge number. So 3 gigatons by 2030. We had lots of discussion in TNC. You know, this is an incredibly ambitious goal. It's something that we plan to do with our own programs. It's also something that we plan to do by influencing others. That piece I mentioned earlier of how do we influence the World Bank to do more, and making sure that we're pushing probably these different drivers now. I think the global emissions per year is about 40 gigatons per year for the whole globe. To put that into perspective for the 3, but then that would include transportation, energy, nature, all these different pieces. Another way to maybe look at it is TNC Science came out in about 2017 and said, we think that we can do about 1/3 of the needed emission reductions by 2030 to meet the Paris goals. Now that 1/3, the nature portion of that is about 11 gigatons. So TNC is looking at, you know, taking a sizable chunk of what the globe can do and helping influence all over in that. Hope those two numbers make sense, but I know it's a huge number and very, very large.
Thank you, John. I appreciate your clarifying that. Steve had put a question in the chat, and we have heard this, and we've actually wondered about this on all levels. Is we heard a lot this year about the Inflation Reduction Act. And obviously that has impacts on multiple levels, but John or maybe Tim or Michelle, whoever would like to take it, you know, maybe John especially can touch on the national and global impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Here, Michelle or Tim, you want to jump in first and I'll follow you? Or I'm happy to go as well too. Just don't want to hog all the time here.
Yeah, Michelle, you can go, and I just have one quick anecdote that I think might be helpful, but Michelle, yeah, please lead.
And I just want to say we're in a really exciting time right now thinking about the federal investments in climate and infrastructure. So there's the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's also the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, both passed over the past 2 years, that are bringing just unprecedented amount of money to our federal government and also to state governments to make investments in climate and clean energy and the infrastructure that we need to really implement a lot of these resources. So I think we as an organization, we as a community, in the state level, at the state government, I think at all these different levels of government, we're figuring out as TNC how we can implement or influence where these dollars are going and have the greatest impact. And so it is an ongoing strategy, at least thinking from the state perspective, how we can deploy some of these funds to achieve our 2030 goals and help to influence the outcomes there. I will say just one piece, we have a new governor in Maryland, Governor Moore. And the Nature Conservancy has been engaging with his administration. And one of our recommendations is to hire somebody in the office of the governor to really think through how we can access these federal funds and use them effectively and efficiently in Maryland. And we're hoping that this type of person can be hired. There's been other infrastructure czars, as they're called, across the US, and having someone like that where we can have some direct access and show where there are some good investment opportunities, I think would be a really exciting opportunity for our state to look into. So we're hoping to engage with the administration on how we're rolling out funds in Maryland, and also thinking through like longer term climate and infrastructure implementation opportunities.
Yeah, I was
Thanks,
just going
Michelle.
to quickly add that one of the things that we're excited about, as Michelle mentioned, I sit on the greenhouse gas working group for the state of Maryland, and we have been sort of essentially cobbling together private philanthropy to help us with policy solutions. Michelle mentioned the building decarbonization study. We're doing a zero emission vehicle study, and those studies were basically funded from you all, people that are on the screen here that have contributed to TNC and have helped to assist TNC, knowing that policy is so important. Through the IRA, there are millions of dollars now available to help us with these types of policy solutions to these sticky problems, to getting to basically rethinking our economy and the way we actually do business. So that is a huge relief in the sense that we don't necessarily have to sort of cobble together sort of smaller bits of private philanthropy to help us solve problems. We can think more holistically, and we can leverage funds at the federal level for policy solutions. So that's just, again, one small, tiny component of this, of billions of dollars that will flow through the IRA and be kind of initiated by and catalyzed by the IRA. But that's just one thing that's going to help states like Maryland, and will help states that have less capacity and less resources than more wealthy states like ours. So that's just, again, a quick anecdote.
Thank you, Tim. John, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I might add two things quickly on that. Those are great. The other piece to look at is, it's a federal legislation, and so it attracts and allows the White House to use a lot of federal levers, whether that's U.S. Forest Service and federal lands and things like that. But then, as Michelle said, it also provides these incentives, which lets all the states enact. But there's not any piece where it says, California, you have to do X amount, New York, you have to do Y amount, or anything like that. But they're hoping to bubble it up through market-based incentives and these different pieces. The other piece was this, I think it was in your question earlier, Casey, of this is really helpful to Joe Biden and John Kerry when they go around to other countries and they can go in and say, we think you should increase your ambition. They used to often get like, yeah, right, you guys go first. Now there's actually a piece of, we did this, can you match us? And I think that really helps us scale up over time.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. We had a question come in from Josie into the chat, and she is asking related to geopolitics. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the tensions increasing between the United States and China right now. How do we think this may affect the path to lowering emission? Do you build in accounting for that when you're establishing the scenarios?
I don't think we don't account for that, but the geopolitical thing is going to be huge. And it's always, taken in through other methods, which into some of those scenarios, they do put inflation, they take economic assumptions, and all of these are forward projections. So lots of different data gets compiled into these projections like that. One of the biggest things that we're seeing happen with the Russian invasion, and talking with our EU team recently, is with all the gas being stopped from coming from Russia into the European Union, the EU is rushing to build more renewable energy, but doesn't always have the capacity to do it immediately. But one of the things we're trying to do is help them site it in the correct places, rather than just say, just go cut down a forest and put in a new solar plant, and that's great. We're saying, here's a bunch of spatial data. We know that this, this mini mall may be closed last year, or this, this area is now registered under a different definition, and you can actually build here without having any consequences. So it's moving. Then the other piece that, the invasion is really having is food. When we were at COP27 in Egypt this last year, Egypt is the largest wheat importer in the world. And Russia and Ukraine are the two largest exporters of wheat in the world. So all of a sudden we're sitting in this geopolitical dynamic where we're negotiating on climate change, but everybody's actually thinking about food and how do we get the ships through and all of this kind of thing. So it's always top of mind.
That's really great perspective, John. Thank you for that. Josie, if you have follow-up questions, please go ahead and add those to the chat. That was excellent to hear. And getting back to the subject of climate finance, John, and actually the staff were discussing this when we were getting ready for the webinar, so I hope that some of our attendees may share their curiosity about going back to the debt for nature swaps and talking about who, we're an engineer, we're really a motivator in that arena. Are we then holding those debts and those loans? You said we're starting to move them out to other entities, but can you give us a little more information about how, does TNC hold debt for countries, or, what can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, TNC very rarely ever holds debt in these kind of things. We're an environmental NGO. We have the tools and the direction, and Tim, jump in on this with me if you would, if you know any more on this swap. But we often do work with private banks. We often work with things like the U.S. Treasury, who have tools that they can de-risk up front. Then the liability will often be held by a bank, and then we have an insurer, say like a Swiss Re or something like that, that would come in and then take on that political risk insurance. So basically, none of this is actually ever on TNC's books, other than the salary of the person that we have operationalizing the deal.
That's really interesting. Thank you, John. I appreciate that answer. Michelle, we have sort of the number one most common question when we gather a group of engaged and enthusiastic people, which is on the Maryland front, the DC front, what is the most urgent thing that people here today can do to have an impact? Is there something coming down the pipeline for 2023 that we can really get our teeth sunk into and hold on to?
Sure. Well, I will share, we are right in the middle of Maryland's 90-day General Assembly session. So our government relations team is really thinking through right now, what is TNC's impact and where can we move some policies in the climate and the conservation space this year, and setting ourselves up for success next year. So I will share right now, our focus is on our climate mitigation work, climate resilience building in the state, and also supporting biodiversity and ensuring that we have policies in place that protect land and species. And we have, I would like to share at some point, either I can share it in the chat here, we can follow up our legislative policy webpage, so you can take a good glance at all of the different issue areas that we're working on right now. We always encourage activism, and if you would like to speak to your member, if you're either your representative from the General Assembly, speak to members of Congress about conservation issues, highly encourage you to do so. And if there's specific issues that we're working on in the General Assembly that you want to talk with us a little bit more about and how you can become engaged, please reach out at any point to our government relations team. I'll also share too, and mention Congress. TNC has an action page too for some of our federal issues. And so while right now we're kind of in the weeds on state policy, we're always engaging at the federal level as well. So our federal team leads here, but our GR team in Maryland, DC are the relationship managers with the Maryland members of Congress. And there's several different pieces of policy in the climate space, in the wildlife space that we're working on right now. And we have an action center where you can use your voice to support some of these bills and to tell your members of Congress that you'd like them to support these pieces of legislation. We're very fortunate to have a General Assembly that's pushing towards really ambitious conservation and climate goals right now. We've got a congressional delegation that's doing the same. So it's an exciting place to be in, but we always encourage action as you can. So we'll share both our legislative page and also the Federal Action Center with you all to take actions on there, and we'd love to discuss further if there's pieces that want to dig into with us.
Yeah,
Thank you,
quickly,
Go ahead, Tim.
add, Casey, that we have a pretty robust public following at the Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Working Group meetings, which are open to the public. It's part of the Greater Maryland Commission on Climate Change. It has a series of working groups from education, communication, and outreach to climate adaptation. And those meetings are public, and there are times reserved for public input. And those are really, you have audience of basically the policy experts within the field. And so we can, if we can put that those notices of those meetings out, I can show you. I can do it. I can put it in the website because I have it up right now, because I was looking at 2 meetings that are upcoming. One is right after this. I'm going to jump to that. But it is really good to participate because Maryland has created the forum for that. Essentially, so people can get involved and engaged in the way that we're setting policy around, again, one of the biggest challenges we have, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Great, thank you, Tim. We had a question come in from Lisa for Michelle, specifically asking, how is the wonderful work that's ongoing in Maryland going to be impacted by our surrounding states if they don't pursue similar goals?
That's a great question. Because you're right, we're not, nature is not defined by state boundaries. I would say one place that I think that the Nature Conservancy has a real great strength is that we, as chapters, are very coordinated on our policy work. So I work closely with government relations staff that are in our surrounding states in the Northeast region to talk about trends and issues and to think more regionally about policy issues. And so it's true there will sometimes be, times where state legislatures are in different states will pass policies or not pass policies that will impact us here in Maryland, but collectively and collaboratively as a conservancy, we can push forward to move policies and hopefully make a good impact. But that is a really good point, and I think that's one of the strengths for TNC is we have this global to local focus. But as we scale up and take a step back from the state policy piece, we can think a little bit more regionally about how we're advancing climate and conservation policies. But thanks, that's a great question.
Thank you, Michelle. I've noticed a couple links have been put into the chat, and thank you everybody for adding those. We will also include those in the follow-up email that we send out after the session. So don't worry about writing things down or clicking and saving. Those will all come in the follow-up email, as well as additional resources for the participants and attendees to use when they want to know more. And of course, if you do have a question, you can always contact the TNC chapter office. We are happy to discuss anything with you and connect you to the person who has the best answer to your question. Then we have one more for Michelle, and that came in from Josie, and she is asking, could you comment a little more on Westmore's new team with relation to environmental protection and climate policy? Are they newcomers? Is there holdovers from the Hogan administration? And how what do you think is going to happen? How different or similar is the immediate future looking for these efforts?
Yeah, also another great question. And so I had mentioned a little bit earlier, the Nature Conservancy, we approach our policy work like we do our conservation work. We're science-based, solutions-oriented, and nonpartisan. And so regardless of who is in government, we are excited, open, willing to work with anyone and everyone who wants to work on policy solutions. And so that means that like we worked with the Hogan administration, we're equally excited to work with the Moore administration and to build relationships and to find those areas of overlap. We'll say that the Moore administration has some exciting and ambitious climate policy goals, and we've already started engaging with the administration offices. We know some folks that have been appointed to secretary level positions, which is great. So a lot of exciting opportunities to collaborate, and we just look forward to the opportunity to continue meeting with those folks at that high level and building out some comprehensive climate policy solutions, work on conservation across the state. So I will just say, at least from the TNC perspective, we'll be working in a similar fashion as we do with all members of elected offices.
I have to mention, Michelle, that to Josie's question is that the person that used to be in Michelle's seat is now the Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources. So Josh Kurtz, who some of you probably know on this call, led our government relations team for the Nature Conservancy for about 8 years. Was involved in our chapter deeply, went to Chesapeake Bay Foundation, is now the new Secretary of DNR. So we have a great relationship with Josh. Obviously, he left on wonderful terms. So we continue to obviously work with him on things that we care about. And again, in a nonpartisan scientific, way. And so, and again, it's a small state when it comes to those connections and those networking. And what I really want to also commend is Michelle and Kate, and their ability to build those relationships has been great and has positioned us in a really good way to influence this new administration, which is extremely receptive. Michelle and I recently met with one of the the governor's leads on the environment, and he was all ears and excited to learn from our experiences. So I'm feeling very positive about this new administration. I felt pretty good about the Hogan administration too. It's some really talented people, and some people have actually been held over, some of the good people, which is great. So I think we're in pretty good shape here. Yeah, so thanks for that question, Jesse.
That's great, Tim. Thank you for contributing that. I do want to be mindful of time. We do try and keep the digital dialogues to about 50 minutes. So I will give our speakers one last opportunity for a closing comment or thought before we begin to wrap up. No pressure.
Well, just thank you guys for the opportunity. It's really exciting to talk about our policy work, and there's so many exciting things happening right now in this space, and just encourage you all, if you want to learn more and engage in state, federal, local policy at any level, please don't hesitate to reach out to the government relations team here at TNC.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, and same for me on the global stuff. Happy to talk further and work with you all. The other piece, back to the question of what can we do at the local level, I'd say whatever you can. You know, everybody knows different people, everybody has different levers and different influence. Do the best you can with where you are and whoever you're working with. And the other good piece with that is it all trickles up to the top as we look at the global greenhouse gas emissions.
Definitely, John. Thank you. All our choices are global, even when they seem quite small. So with that, then I will transition us a little bit. I'll ask Dylan to put up the final slide and the results of our poll today. Again, to remind everybody, we asked what very historic act was passed 50 years ago this year in 1973. We had, a 50-50 split between the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. I love that. Now we get to teach, because the correct answer is the Endangered Species Act. It was signed and finalized in 1973. To be fair, clean air and clean water were right in front of it. They were in 70 and 72. They were all signed by President Nixon in very rapid order. And it may seem sort of nostalgic and almost quaint to us now, but when the Endangered Species Act passed during the Nixon presidency, it made it through the Senate at a vote of 92-0, and it had House support of 390-12. So we can look back on that with a sense of pride, but it also really reflects the fact that when they passed the ESA, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. They didn't know if it would work or endure. And here we are 50 years later thinking that these are some of the most significant pieces of legislation for nature that have passed, and that they started the things that are leading to the COP meetings and the Inflation Reduction Act, and the things will have impact in the future, so that we know that 50 years from now, we'll be able to gather and look at these and know that they had real impact. I want to thank both Michelle and John for giving up their valuable time, especially when there are sessions and meetings going on all the time in this season of the year. This certainly could take precedence. We appreciate you making that space and that time to talk to our constituents about this. And I want to remind everybody that we will be sending out an email in the next week or so. Keep an eye out for that. It will have the relevant links and information to get more, both the recording and also if you want to dig in and get more information or reach out to someone at the chapter, you can please do that. And if you have any other questions, again, always reach out. For those of you that like to mark your calendars and know well in advance, our next digital dialogue is scheduled for Thursday, May 18th, about 12 weeks away. So you can mark your calendar now, or also keep your eye on email. In the next few weeks, we'll be sending out those invitations with the topic and the details. And with that, I will bring us to a close and thank everyone for being here today. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you online again soon. Have a great afternoon.